The music was playing, people were laughing, and glasses of champagne sparkled under the lights of the grand wedding hall. Everyone seemed to belong except me. I stood in the corner, tugging at my sleeve, trying to blend into the background while my sister glowed in her white gown. She was radiant, surrounded by her friends, her new husband, and the approval of every relative who had ever compared me to her. I thought I had made peace with my role as the odd one out in the family, the one who never lived up to expectations. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. When she raised her glass to give a speech, her eyes scanned the room before landing squarely on me. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp, cutting, meant to pierce me in front of everyone. "And of course," she said loudly, "we couldn't have a true family gathering without our family embarrassment." Laughter rippled through the crowd. My chest tightened, heat rushed to my face, and I wished the floor would open up and swallow me whole. I had been insulted before, but never like this. Not under a chandelier, not in front of hundreds of people, and certainly not on one of the most important nights of her life. As I tried to hold back tears, I heard a calm voice beside me. "Hi," it said, warm and steady, as if I wasn't invisible anymore. I turned and there he was, the best man, hand outstretched, eyes kind. He leaned in just enough so only I could hear. "I don't believe a word of that. You don't look like an embarrassment to me." That moment changed everything. The wedding hall was like something out of a movie, a place where every detail sparkled as if designed to remind me that I did not belong. The golden chandeliers shimmered above, catching the light of hundreds of candles. White roses lined the tables, and laughter rose in waves from every corner of the room. Guests in elegant suits and glittering gowns moved about confidently, raising their glasses of champagne and speaking as though they had all known each other for years. And then there was me, standing near the far wall, tugging at the edge of my sleeve, pretending to look at the decorations so no one would notice how out of place I felt. My sister was the star of the night. She glowed in her wedding dress, every strand of her perfectly styled hair staying in place as though she had been carved from porcelain. Her smile was wide, her posture flawless, her laugh crisp and practiced. People leaned toward her when she spoke, as if every word she uttered deserved applause. I knew this scene too well. I had lived my entire life in her shadow. As children, she had been the golden child who collected trophies and praise, while I was the one who stumbled, the one who had potential but never quite lived up to it. I thought I had grown used to that role. I had convinced myself that I no longer cared what people thought, that I had accepted the quiet corner of every family gathering as my rightful place. But that night, as the music swelled and the eyes of our relatives shone with admiration for her, the old sting returned. I was once again the sibling who did not shine, the one nobody came to greet first, the one people noticed only after they had nothing else to talk about. I was about to slip away to the restroom, just to breathe without feeling the weight of the crowd pressing against me, when I heard her voice rise above the music. She was giving a toast. My heart sank because I knew that whenever she held the spotlight, she couldn't resist turning it into a moment of comparison. Her new husband stood by her side, proud and glowing, while the guests hushed in anticipation. She raised her glass, her eyes sweeping the room, her words dripping with confidence as she thanked everyone for coming. People cheered, clinked their glasses, and admired her as though she were royalty. For a moment I thought maybe she would spare me. Maybe, just this once, she would focus on her happiness and leave me out of it. But then her eyes found me. The pause in her speech was slight, almost invisible to anyone else, but I felt it like a knife against my skin. "And of course," she said, smiling with the same sweet but sharp look she used to give me when we were children, "we couldn't have a true family gathering without our family embarrassment." The words cut through the room. At first, silence followed, as if people weren't sure they had heard correctly. Then came the ripple of laughter, small at first, then louder as more guests joined in, eager to show loyalty to the bride. My face burned as though I had stepped too close to a fire. My throat closed up, and my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the glass of water I was holding. I had been insulted before many times, but never like this. Not under the glow of chandeliers, not in front of relatives, colleagues, and strangers who didn't know me well enough to understand the cruelty of the joke. In that moment, I felt stripped bare, every insecurity I had ever carried displayed for the world to see. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into the shadows, to run until the laughter no longer reached me. I forced myself to look down, pretending to adjust my sleeve again, pretending I didn't hear, pretending it didn't hurt. But the sting was unbearable. My sister had managed to do what she always did, turn me into a punchline. Only this time, she had chosen her wedding, the night of her supposed happiness, to make me feel smaller than ever. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice beside me. Calm, warm, and steady. "Hi," it said softly, cutting through the laughter as though it had been waiting for the right moment. I turned, startled, and found myself looking into the kindest eyes I had seen in a long time. The best man stood there, tall and confident, holding his glass loosely as if the entire hall didn't faze him. His smile wasn't forced or polite. It was genuine, the kind of smile that made you feel safe without knowing why. "I don't believe a word of that," he said quietly, leaning just close enough that only I could hear. "You don't look like an embarrassment to me." For a moment I couldn't speak. I stared at him, my mind spinning, wondering why he would say that, why he would notice me at all. People usually brushed past me, especially at events where my sister was present. Yet here he was, giving me his attention as if I mattered. I managed a weak smile, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He extended his hand. "Daniel," he said, introducing himself with such ease that it felt natural, as though this meeting had been waiting to happen all along. I shook his hand, my own still trembling slightly. I know," he interrupted gently, his eyes kind. "Your sister's been talking about you. But I'd rather hear about you from you." The words surprised me. Most people already had an idea of who I was, or rather, who they thought I was. They rarely asked for my version of the story. But Daniel's tone was different. He wasn't mocking, he wasn't curious in the way people sometimes are when they want gossip. He sounded genuinely interested. And so, while the room roared with laughter, toasts, and music, we stood in our own quiet bubble. He asked about my work, my hobbies, even my favorite books. I found myself talking, really talking, in a way I hadn't in years. My voice shook at first, but the more I spoke, the more his encouraging smile gave me strength. It was as if he was reminding me that I wasn't invisible, that I had stories worth telling, that my life was more than the cruel label my sister had stamped on me. For the rest of the evening, I wasn't the shadow in the corner. At least not to him. Every time my sister's laughter rang out, every time her admirers circled her like moths around a flame, I remembered his words. "You don't look like an embarrassment to me." They were simple words, yet they carried more weight than any compliment I had ever received. By the time the night ended, I walked out of that wedding hall with a different kind of memory. Yes, I would always remember the sting of my sister's public cruelty. But alongside it, I would remember Daniel's hand extended toward me. His voice steady, his eyes sincere. I would remember the moment someone chose to see me, not as the family disappointment, not as the one who never measured up, but as someone worth noticing. And deep down, even though I didn't know it yet, I understood that moment would change everything. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with a strange heaviness in my chest. The memory of my sister's cruel words played over and over again in my mind, as if my brain had decided to set it on repeat. Family embarrassment. The phrase echoed with the same sting it had carried the night before. I could still hear the laughter, still see the smirks on the faces of people who hadn't even tried to hide their amusement. Normally, after an event like that, I would bury myself in silence, avoiding everyone, avoiding myself. But something was different this time. Alongside the ache of humiliation, there was another memory, softer, quieter, yet somehow louder in my heart, the memory of Daniel's voice. "You don't look like an embarrassment to me." It was such a simple sentence, but it clung to me like a lifeline. I found myself replaying not only his words but the sincerity in his eyes when he said them. He hadn't said it to make me feel better in passing. He had said it as if he meant every syllable. And then there was his smile, That easy warmth that made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore. I had known him for less than a night, yet somehow, he had managed to plant a seed of hope in soil I had thought was long dead. I went about my day as I usually did, quietly without much fuss. I cooked myself breakfast, though I barely tasted it. I tried to read a book, but every page blurred because my mind kept drifting back to him. And by the time evening rolled around, I realized that I wanted something I had never allowed myself to want before. I wanted to see him again. A few days later, the opportunity came sooner than I expected. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was a mistake until I opened it. "Hi, this is Daniel. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I just wanted to check in on you after the wedding." My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't forgotten. I sat staring at the screen for what felt like forever, trying to decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to gush, to thank him for noticing me, for making me feel human again. Another part of me was terrified that maybe this was pity, nothing more. In the end, I typed back something safe. "Hi Daniel, thanks for checking in. I'm okay, just a little tired." Seconds turned to minutes before his reply came, but when it did, it carried the same warmth as his voice. "Tired is understandable. Weddings are exhausting, even if you're not the bride or groom. Do you want to grab coffee sometime? I'd love to actually hear more about you, without all the noise of a ballroom." For a moment I just stared at the words. No one had ever asked to spend time with me like that, not without it being an obligation. My first instinct was to refuse, to protect myself from the risk of being disappointed. But something inside me whispered, "Why not?" "Sure," I replied, my fingers trembling as I pressed send. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place where the smell of roasted beans lingered in the air and soft music hummed in the background. I arrived early, nervous and second-guessing my choice of clothes, but when he walked in, all my fears began to fade. He smiled as though seeing me was the highlight of his day. "You made it," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Of course," I replied, though my voice wavered slightly. From that moment on, the conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked me about my work, my favorite books, the places I wanted to travel. And unlike most people who ask such questions only to fill silence, he listened, really listened. His eyes stayed on mine, his expression open, as though every word I said carried weight. I found myself telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone else, the way I loved to write late at night, even though I never showed my stories to anyone, the way I sometimes walk through the city just to watch people and imagine their lives. I admitted that I often felt invisible, as though my sister's brilliance had erased me before I even had a chance to step into the light. Daniel leaned back, his brow furrowed slightly, but not in judgment. "Invisible? That's hard for me to imagine. You're captivating, actually. The way you describe things, the way you see the world, it's rare." His words hit me harder than I expected. Captivating. No one had ever used that word about me. For so long I had been the disappointment, the shy one, the awkward sibling. To hear something so different, so gentle yet powerful, felt like a crack of sunlight breaking through a storm. As the hours passed, I laughed more than I thought possible. He had a way of making ordinary stories sound extraordinary, and he never made me feel small. By the time we finished our coffee, I realized I didn't want the night to end. But before I could gather the courage to say it, Daniel smiled and asked, "Can we do this again? Soon?" I nodded, a small warmth spreading through my chest. "Yes, I'd like that." Our meetings became more frequent after that. Dinners, walks through the park, conversations that stretched until midnight. With every passing day, the wall I had built around myself began to crumble. He never pushed me, never made me feel like I had to be more than I was. Instead, he seemed to delight in every part of me, even the pieces I thought were unworthy. But with every step forward, I felt the shadow of my sister looming behind me. At family gatherings, she continued to flaunt her new life, her new husband, her charm. Whenever Daniel's name slipped into conversation, she smirked, as if the idea of him spending time with me was absurd. "Oh, he's just being nice," she said once when she caught me smiling at a memory of him. "Don't get your hopes up. Guys like him don't stay interested in girls like you." Her words stung, of course. They always did. But this time they didn't cut as deep. Because when I looked at Daniel, when I listened to the way he spoke to me, I knew she was wrong. He wasn't with me out of pity. He was with me because he wanted to be. And little by little, I began to want to believe it myself. One evening, as we sat on a bench watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel turned to me with a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "You know," he said, "when your sister made that comment at the wedding." I was furious. I wanted to say something right then, but I figured the best way to prove her wrong was just to get to know you myself. And I'm glad I did, because you're nothing like what she said. You're more than enough. The words settled deep in my heart, soothing wounds I had carried for years. I didn't reply immediately. I couldn't. My throat felt too tight, my eyes too full. But I managed to whisper, "Thank you." That night when I went home, I looked at myself in the mirror differently. For the first time in my life, I didn't see only the flaws, the mistakes, the comparisons. I saw someone worth knowing, someone worth loving. And though I didn't know where the path with Daniel would lead, I knew one thing with certainty. My sister's words no longer defined me. Because for the first time I had begun to define myself. Weeks turned into months, and with every passing day, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't thought possible. For years I had lived quietly, staying out of the spotlight, avoiding situations where my flaws could be magnified. But with Daniel it felt different. I didn't need to hide my awkwardness or pretend to be someone else. He welcomed every version of me. The shy silences, the bursts of laughter, the uncertain pauses. Slowly, his presence gave me courage, and courage gave me freedom. I began to notice the small shifts first. At work, I used to keep my head down, doing what was asked and nothing more, afraid of drawing too much attention. But one day, after Daniel had spent an evening reminding me that my voice mattered, I spoke up in a meeting. My idea wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and to my surprise, people listened. They nodded, even complimented me afterward. Walking out of that room, I couldn't help but think of Daniel and the way he always insisted that I had more to offer than I believed. But for all the quiet growth blossoming inside me, there was also a storm building around me, my sister. She was never one to ignore a shift in attention, and she noticed quickly when Daniel began appearing more often by my side. At first, she made little comments, disguised as jokes. "Wow, he must really like charity work," she'd say, her laughter sharp as glass. Or, "Be careful, don't scare him off with too much honesty." I tried to ignore her, tried to tell myself that her words no longer had the power to crush me. But each remark carried the same familiar sting, reminding me of all the years she had cast me as the lesser one. The first time Daniel attended a family dinner with me, I braced myself for the storm. My sister's eyes widened the moment he walked in. Her practiced smile faltering for just a second before she composed herself. "Daniel," she said sweetly, stretching out his name like it belonged to her. "What a surprise." He smiled politely, but I noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the way he positioned himself closer to me as if to make a quiet statement. "Not really a surprise," he said evenly. "I'm here with her." His hand brushed mine under the table, and warmth spread through my chest at his quiet defiance. Throughout the evening, my sister tried her usual tactics. She dominated the conversation, steering it back to herself whenever possible, tossing little jabs my way when she thought no one else was paying attention. But Daniel noticed. Each time she tried to diminish me, he countered with something gentle yet powerful, a reminder of my creativity, my humor, my resilience. By the end of dinner, for the first time in years, the table's attention wasn't only on her. Later that night as we walked home I whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" he asked, his eyes soft but steady. "Defend me like that. It's just how it always is with her." He stopped walking, turning to face me fully. "I didn't defend you out of pity. I defended you because she was wrong. And because you deserve better than to let her keep rewriting your story." The firmness in his voice startled me, not because it was harsh but because it was filled with conviction. I had spent my life doubting myself, bending under the weight of other people's opinions. But Daniel spoke as though there was no room for doubt, like my worth was undeniable, even if I couldn't yet see it myself. His words became my anchor in the weeks that followed. I started writing again, the stories I had once hidden away in notebooks collecting dust. Daniel encouraged me to share them, at least with him. Nervously, I handed him one on a rainy afternoon. I sat across from him as he read, my heart racing, waiting for the polite smile, the soft "it's nice" that people say when they don't mean it. But when he finished, he looked at me with something like awe. "This is beautiful," he said simply. "You have a gift. Why have you been hiding it?" I shrugged, unable to meet his eyes. "Because no one ever wanted to hear my stories." "Well, I do," he said firmly. "And I think a lot of other people would too." It was a small moment, yet it cracked open something inside me. I had never thought of myself as someone who could create something worth sharing. But the way he spoke, the certainty in his tone, made me wonder if maybe I had been wrong all these years. Of course, my sister noticed the change. She noticed everything. One afternoon, she called me out of the blue. Her voice sugar-coated but her words sharp. "So, I hear you and Daniel are spending a lot of time together," she said, drawing out the sentence like she was tasting every syllable. I hesitated. "We are, yes." There was a pause, the kind that wasn't silent but heavy, filled with unspoken things. Then she laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Just be careful. You know how you get your hopes up. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself again." The old me would have crumbled at her words, would have carried them like chains around my neck. But this time something inside me refused to bend. "Maybe I don't need your warnings anymore," I said quietly. My voice shook, but the words were mine. And before she could respond, I ended the call. That night, I told Daniel what had happened. He listened silently, his jaw tightening slightly, but he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he reached for my hand. "She doesn't get to decide your story anymore," he said softly. "You do. And I'll be here, reminding you of that, for as long as you'll let me." Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness but from something deeper. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. For so long, I had believed that I was destined to live in my sister's shadow. But with Daniel, I felt the first flickers of light within me. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving my place in the family. I was stepping out of the corner, daring to exist fully. As the weeks rolled on, I began to understand something I had never grasped before. Confidence isn't loud or showy. Sometimes confidence is simply the quiet belief that you deserve to take up space. And with Daniel by my side, that belief began to grow stronger each day. But even as I grew, I knew one truth remained. My sister wouldn't let go of her power so easily. And deep down, I felt the tension building, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. It started with whispers. Small, carefully placed remarks that floated back to me through relatives, friends, and even colleagues who had no business knowing. My sister had always been skilled at spinning narratives, but now her target was unmistakable. Me and Daniel. First it was subtle. "I'm just worried about her," she told an aunt, her voice dripping with faux concern. "She gets too attached too quickly. I'd hate to see her humiliated again." But then the whispers grew sharper, less disguised. "Daniel's only being kind," she told another cousin. "He'll move on soon. Everyone knows he could do better." The words reached me slowly, each one like a pebble dropped into the still water of my life, creating ripples that threatened to disturb the fragile confidence I had been building. I tried to ignore them. I tried to remind myself of Daniel's steady gaze, his unwavering kindness. But late at night, when I lay awake in the quiet of my room, the old doubts returned. What if she was right? What if all of this, the dinners, the laughter, the long conversations, was nothing more than pity? One evening, Daniel noticed my silence as we walked through the park. The trees were bare, their branches reaching toward the pale winter sky. "You're quiet tonight," he said gently. I hesitated, afraid to sound foolish, but the words spilled out anyway. Do you ever think maybe you're only here because you feel sorry for me? He stopped walking, turning to face me with a look of disbelief. What? Well, why would you think that? I looked down at the ground, kicking at a stray leaf. Because that's what she says. That's what everyone says. That I'm just the family embarrassment, and you're too good to waste your time on me. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and tense. Then Daniel stepped closer, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his eyes. Listen to me, he said firmly. His voice steady and full of conviction. I am here because I want to be here. 'Cause I like being with you. Because you make me laugh and you make me think, and you make me feel alive in ways no one else ever has. I don't care what your sister says. She doesn't know me, and she clearly doesn't know you either. His words washed over me like sunlight breaking through clouds. I wanted to believe them desperately. And in that moment I did. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Thank you, I whispered, my voice shaky. But my sister wasn't done. A week later, she invited me to lunch under the guise of wanting to catch up. I should have known better. From the moment I sat down, I could see the glint in her eyes. The same glint she had carried since childhood whenever she was about to crush me. So, she began casually, stirring her coffee with unnecessary precision. How are things with Daniel? I smiled faintly, refusing to let her see the tension she created. They're good. Good, she repeated, her voice laced with mock amusement. Well, enjoy it while it lasts. You do realize he's not serious, right? Men like him don't commit to women like you. You're just practice. The words hit hard, sharper than I wanted to admit. My stomach tightened, my fingers clenching around the edge of my cup. You don't know that, I said softly, my voice trembling but firm. Her smile widened, triumphant, as if she had won something. I know men. And I know you. You've always been desperate for scraps of attention. Don't embarrass yourself by believing this will turn into anything real. I wanted to shout, to throw her cruelty back at her, but the years of being silenced, belittled, and dismissed wrapped tightly around me. So I did what I had always done. I sat quietly, letting her words seep into me like poison. That night, when I told Daniel what she had said, he listened with a frown deepening across his face. She's wrong, he said firmly, his hand gripping mine. She's wrong and she knows it. That's why she's trying so hard to break you down, because she sees what I see, and it terrifies her. What do you see? I asked, my voice barely audible. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I see someone strong, someone worth knowing, someone worth loving. And I won't let anyone convince you otherwise. His words should have been enough to silence the doubts, but the more my sister pushed, the harder it became to ignore her. She wasn't just trying to poison my confidence. She was starting to involve Daniel directly. At the next family gathering, she cornered him when I wasn't around. Later he told me what she had said, that she had warned him not to lead me on, that she had implied I was fragile, unstable, incapable of handling disappointment. When he told me, my chest burned with both anger and shame. Anger that she would go so far, shame that she might be right. But Daniel only shook his head, his eyes steady. She doesn't scare me, he said calmly. But I need to know, does she scare you? I thought about it long and hard. For most of my life, yes, she had terrified me. Not physically, but emotionally. She had the power to unravel me with a few well-placed words, to reduce me to silence with nothing more than a laugh. But now, standing on the edge of something real with Daniel, I realized that letting her continue meant losing not only him but myself. No, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. Not anymore. From that moment something shifted. I began standing taller, speaking louder, refusing to let her barbs pierce as deeply. At the next family dinner, when she made another cutting remark, "Careful, don't scare him away with all your neediness," I didn't shrink. I looked her in the eye and replied, "If he's here, it's because he wants to be. Not because you think he should or shouldn't." The room went silent, relatives blinking in surprise, forks pausing mid-air. My sister's smile faltered just slightly, before she recovered with a dismissive laugh. But I saw it, the crack in her confidence. For the first time I had pushed back. Later, Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, his eyes shining with quiet pride. "That's the you I've always seen," he whispered. And as I sat there, surrounded by the very family that had once only seen me as an embarrassment, I realized something profound. I was no longer defined by my sister's words. Her cruelty might still sting, but it no longer controlled me. I had a voice, and I had someone by my side who reminded me of it every day. But deep down, I knew the battle wasn't over. My sister wasn't the type to surrender easily. And though I had found my strength, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing something bigger, something meant to shatter me completely. For the first time in my life, though, I wasn't afraid. Because I wasn't standing alone anymore. The morning of my sister's family dinner arrived with an unsettling mix of nerves and courage swirling inside me. For years, gatherings like these had been a battlefield, one where my armor was silence and retreat, where every joke at my expense felt like a dart I was too slow to dodge. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't walking in as the quiet shadow hiding in the corner. I was walking in beside Daniel, the best man who had once extended his hand in the moment of my greatest humiliation and never let go since. His calm presence was a shield stronger than anything I had ever carried alone. I could feel his warmth even as we pulled into my parents' driveway, the familiar house looming ahead with its windows glowing like watchful eyes. "You're not walking into enemy territory," Daniel said softly as he parked, his hand brushing mine reassuringly. "You're just walking into a house where people don't yet know how remarkable you are. Let's show them." His words steadied me, and for the first time I believed them. Inside, the house buzzed with the chatter of cousins, uncles, and old family friends. My mother was in her element, fluttering about with trays of food and eager greetings, her face lighting up when she saw us. "You came," she said, surprise slipping into her voice as though she hadn't expected me to show. Her eyes then flicked to Daniel, curiosity softening her tone. "And you brought someone." I introduced him with as much steadiness as I could manage, and Daniel's polite charm immediately smoothed the moment. He shook hands, asked thoughtful questions, and soon had people smiling. But despite the warmth, I could already feel the tension building like storm clouds, because my sister hadn't yet made her entrance. And when she finally did, she didn't disappoint. Dressed impeccably as always, she glided into the room with a smirk tugging at her lips, her eyes narrowing the instant they landed on me. "Well, well," she said loud enough for half the room to hear. "The family embarrassment actually showed up. And look, she brought someone to witness it." A few nervous laughs followed, the kind of uncomfortable laughter people use when they don't want to be caught on the wrong side of the cruelty. The old me would have shrunk, would have found a reason to excuse myself to the bathroom, or maybe even slipped quietly out the door. But Daniel's hand slid gently against mine under the table, grounding me in a way that reminded me I wasn't alone anymore. Before I could speak, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Funny," he said, his eyes steady on her, "because from where I'm sitting, she looks like the most interesting person in the room." The table went quiet. The smirk on my sister's face faltered for a second, just enough for me to catch it, and then she rolled her eyes as though his words were a trivial defense. But the silence around us told a different story. People were listening. People were noticing. The rest of dinner became a tug-of-war I hadn't expected. My sister would make little jabs about my career, about how I never measured up, about how she had always been the one to make the family proud. Each time Daniel countered, not with anger, not with the same sharpness she wielded, but with quiet strength. He praised my resilience, mentioned my creativity, pointed out my wit during conversations where I naturally made people laugh. Bit by bit, the tide shifted. I could feel the room softening, see people turning toward me in genuine curiosity instead of forced politeness. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible at a family gathering. My voice mattered. My stories drew laughter and interest. My sister noticed, of course. Her smile tightened, her posture stiffened, and though she tried to regain control with louder anecdotes and grand gestures, the attention wasn't clinging to her the way it always had. It was disorienting for her, I think, to see the dynamic change before her eyes, to see me, her forever embarrassment, being seen differently. Later in the evening, after the dishes were cleared and people gathered in the living room with coffee, my sister cornered me near the hallway. Her voice was low, sharp like a knife drawn in secret. Don't think for a second that just because you brought someone here, people are suddenly going to see you differently. You'll always be the disappointment. That's who you are. Her words stung, but they didn't cut the way they used to. Because I finally knew they weren't the truth. For so long I had let her definition of me shape the way I saw myself, but Daniel's presence, and the small but significant shifts I had felt tonight, proved otherwise. No, I said softly but firmly, meeting her eyes for the first time without flinching. That's who I was to you. But it's not who I am anymore. She blinked, taken aback, as though she hadn't expected me to fight back, as though my voice had no right to rise against hers. I walked away before she could answer, my heart racing but my spine straight. For once, I left her words behind instead of carrying them on my shoulders. The night wound down, guests trickling out with hugs and goodbyes. As Daniel and I stepped outside into the cool air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The stars above seemed brighter, the air fresher, as though the universe itself was applauding the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside me. Daniel wrapped his arm around me and kissed the top of my head. "You were incredible in there," he whispered. "You didn't need me to defend you. You were strong all on your own. But I'm glad I was here to watch you shine." His words warmed me more than the night air ever could. In the days and weeks that followed, I noticed a change, not only in myself but in how others treated me. Cousins texted me to ask about my work. An aunt called just to chat. My parents looked at me with a gentleness that felt different, as though they, too, were beginning to see the daughter they had overlooked. My sister remained distant, her pride too thick to allow acknowledgement of the shift, but that was no longer my burden to carry. For once, I didn't crave her approval. I didn't need it. Months later, Daniel and I stood in a park where the trees whispered with the promise of spring, and he took my hand the same way he had at that wedding, steady and sure. Only this time he didn't just offer reassurance. He offered a future. With a trembling smile. He asked me to build a life with him, to choose each other every day the way he had chosen to see me when no one else did. Tears filled my eyes as I said yes, not just to him, but to the life I had once believed I didn't deserve. Looking back, I realized that my sister's cruel words at her wedding were not the end of my story. They were the beginning. She thought she was exposing my weakness, but she had unknowingly led me to the greatest strength of my life. Because in that moment of public humiliation, I met the person who saw through the label, who reminded me that family isn't defined by the ones who tear you down, but by those who lift you up. And so, the girl once branded the family embarrassment walked forward not in shame, but in love, in courage, and in the certainty that she was never less, never invisible, and never unworthy. My story ended where hers began, in a wedding hall, but my life, my true life, was only just beginning. Backhand index pointing right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more powerful and emotional stories every week.